Well, hey there, everybody. What I wanted to do today was to go over the FRQs that I've given you. I gave you two questions the other day, and so I'll go over the answers to that. And then there was one that I made a mistake. There was three parts. I only gave you two. So we'll start with that. Do the same thing that I've done before. I'll go over the problem, a little bit of an algorithm, and then my code, show you what the College Board was looking for, their rubric, and there you go. So yeah, here's what we got. So the third part that I forgot to give you was on this thing called the log message. The first two parts were in the log message class. You had to write the constructor for that, and then the other part, uh, forget. Oh, you're testing to see whether or not it contained a given word, and that part B was very similar to the Magpie lab that we did earlier in the year. And then part C was a whole nother class that I overlooked. And in part C, we're going to remove messages from an array list. And then we're going to return all of the messages that were deleted, as it were, or removed from that. So that's part C. So here is what we're looking at with that. Here's my algorithm for it. So they want to see an array list of log messages objects that we've removed. So we have to create an empty one. We traverse the existing array list of log messages and looking for those that contain a given word. Couple things, whenever you see, and the College Board does this a fair amount, where they will say, here's an array list, remove certain elements. So when you are using when you're doing that, when you're taking elements out of an array list, you've got to use a traditional for. And the main reason for that is that you have this thing called a concurrency issue. And that means that because array lists are dynamic, they can grow and shrink during that process. And especially if you shrink it, those initial values of what the state is, those are set at the beginning of the for each loop. And so if you shrink it down, then you could definitely have a problem. So you'll get an error message if you try to do that. So you got to use, if you're looking to delete elements, especially from an array list, you've got to use a traditional for in order to do that. We have to call the contains word method. That's also in the instructions that irrespective of what we did previously, we've got to call that method. They like doing that. That's a pretty typical thing for them to do. If it does contain the parameter, then we want to add that log message item into the new array list that we just made. We're going to remove it from the array list, and then we have to decrement the iterator afterwards. And I'll talk about that, the reason for that, in just a second. When we're done with our for loop, the last thing we're going to do is return that array list. Again, I do think it's a good idea to walk through and identify all of the what are the steps that you're going to need to do, and it's just going to make your coding a lot easier. So let's talk a little bit about what happens when you start to remove elements from an array list, particularly if you're using a traditional for loop to do that. So let's say I've got an array here of animals, and my task is I want to remove all of the cats from that particular list. All right. So if we just do it the standard way, and I think I did talk a little bit about this previously when we actually were meeting as a class. So I'm going to start at 0. So for I equals 0, I is less than animals dot length I plus plus. So here, the first element is a cat, and I want to remove that. So that's going to get deleted, and all these guys are going to get shift down 1. So instead of there being 8 elements, there's going to be 7. The index of the last one is going to be number 6. This one's going to be gone. It's going to go bear, cat, cat, elephant, fish, cat, hippo. And that's going to be the new array. So sure enough, that's in fact what happens. I'm done with the first step. Well, what then occurs is I'm at the end of the first time through my loop. So the iterator increases from 0 to 1. And now I'm looking at this next element, which in this particular case is okay, but you might notice that we did not check what was happening with bear. So we reduced cat, the first cat, from that array list, and we didn't look at what happened next. All right, it just so happened that everything kind of worked out because that a bear is not a cat, and so we can move on. But watch what happens if we have 2 cats in a row. All right, so in that situation, I want to remove, this is a cat, so I want to remove them all. So this guy's going to go away, and all of these other elements are going to shift down 1, and it's going to go from 7 elements to 6. There they go. And now I've got this cat that is in position 1. That's the end of my loop. So what does the iterator do? It increases by 1, and we skip over it. So there's a problem. So now, even though I'm supposed to remove all the cats, I have an extra one because there were 2 elements that were the same type. And whenever that happens, then you are going to have an issue that's going to go on with that. All right. So whenever you're removing elements from from an array list, if you're doing that in a loop, remember that you've got to decrement your iterator when you do that. All right. And that's also the reason for the concurrency issues when you're trying to use a for each loop. All right. So let's watch what happens when we try to do that. And we do decrement. All right. So again, this is my amazing animations here. You're supposed to be dazzled by what comes next. Really, I am looking for a new job at Disney. I think I've got a pretty good chance at it. So, all right. So here's the same array. I'm going to look at my cat here. Yep, that's supposed to be gone. So the same thing happens. So I'm going to reduce my array by 1, and everything is just the way that it should be. Now what I want to do is I want to decrement that iterator. And what's going to happen is the iterator was 0, and now it's going to go to -1, which red flags should go up. But because at the end of this loop, I'll be incrementing that again, it went from -1 for just a nanosecond and then back to 0. So I'll decrease the iterator, but then I'm going to increment it again when it starts the loop the second time. It went from -1 to now 0. And now I'm looking at the bear, and the bear is in fact a valid animal to keep in my array list. So nothing's going to happen. We're going to move on to the second position. Well, the second position is a cat. So the same thing that we're going to do, we're going to get rid of this cat. We're going to shift all these guys down 1. And I think, so there it goes. And I want to decrement that iterator at the very end. So it was 1, now it's going to go to 0. I'm done with the end with that loop. So the iterator increments back. And now I'm looking at 1 again. Oh, that too is a cat. So instead of skipping over the second element in a row, it is in fact going to look at the one that just got moved into that slot. The cat should be removed. So it's going to get removed. The other guys get moved down. The iterator is going to decrement again at the end of the loop. It's going to increment. So it goes back to 1. An elephant is in fact not a cat. So it moves on, and then we're off to the races. So hopefully that little animation, that little illustration made it clear that if you are asked to remove elements from an array list, you got to be really careful to make sure that you decrease the iterator, and then whenever you do that, and that way you're making sure that I'm removing all elements that are of a particular list. If you were just removing one element, they said find the first element that is a cat. Okay, you don't need to do it. But if you're all elements, then yeah, you're going to need to decrement the iterator through that. All right, I think that's it. I think that's it. So let's take a look at I'm supposed to remove all the messages that contain a specific keyword. So here is here's the method declaration called remove messages. It's got a keyword as a string, the parameter. That's what I'm looking for. Notice that it is returning an array list of log message objects. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create an empty array list of log message objects. And that is ultimately going to be what I'm going to return at the very end. So just make sure that if it says that you're returning an int or returning a Boolean, that you're going to make that return type, and then make sure that it gets passed back at the very end. Make sure too that if it says nope, it's a void, that you do not return that. That's a nice way that the College Board tries to get you by dinging you if you were to actually do that. So I'm going to use a traditional for because when I'm removing objects from an array list, I'll get concurrency issues if I don't. So I'm going to start at 0, go to the size, increment by 1. And there's different ways of doing this. I'm going to get the next log message object out of my array list. And I believe that's called message list. So the other thing that at the College Board it dings people on is if they use the wrong names for things. So do make sure that, oh, this one is called orders, or it's called message list, or it's got the right name. So I'm going to get the next message out of my array list. That's in the this guy here is the name of it's an instance variable in the class. In the previous, in part B, we wrote the contains word method. And so we're going to call that. Notice that I'm calling the parameter. I'm testing to see, does it contain key? I made this red. That's not necessary. Reads a little easier. It's a little cleaner, perhaps, as you're just making sure, yeah, that it in fact does equal true. But that is also a bit redundant. All right, so just true equal true. Well, yeah, it does. So you could just write ln dot contains word key, and that is going to be the condition. All right, so if that is in fact there, I want to do some things. I'm going to add ln, that's the log message that has this word, to this array list that I just I created. Right, so the one that is originally empty is going to be, that element is going to be added to it. Sorry about that, wrong button. And then the next thing I want to do is I'm going to remove that element at the given index from message list. That's the master list. And here's where I'm decrementing the iterator. And I can't really see it there. And hopefully that thing will go away. And then when I'm done with all that, those are the three things I'm going to do in that if statement. I'm done with the if. That's also the end of my for loop. So when I get outside of that for loop, I'm done. I've removed them all, and I'm going to return the array list that I just made. All right. So that was my solution. I'll show you. This is the way that the College Board did it. Same sort of thing. They created a new array list. They have a traditional for. What they did is this. So I stored the next element in a temp message. And what they're doing here is they're getting it. Does that contain the keyword? So they're doing a couple of things on the same line. And again, this is a Boolean, so they didn't test to see does it equal that. And then what they did is they added and removed on the same line. It means that you have to remember that the remove method that takes an int as a parameter, that returns the actual object that you are removing. So we're removing it from one list, we're adding it to the other, all on the same line. So a little slick. If you get it and makes sense, obviously go for it. I think doing it step by step, even if it means that you've got a few more lines to get that code to work, but it's clearer, it makes more sense to you, then by all means go for that. So it's a little like the double equals true. To me, I can read it. It's really clear. I know I'm not making a mistake in that. And same thing over here. So if you got the stored things in temps and called it by its name, I think that may be easier. It's up to you to make that. You do need to still decrement that, the iterator. So when I remove it, I'm going to go subtract 1 from that. That's the end of the for loop. So it's going to then increase again by 1, and I'll make sure that any duplicates get eliminated. So that was the College Board solution. Same point that I just made. Here is how they chose to score it. So on this one, this is 5 points. That means that the first part A, which was the constructor, that really wasn't that hard or that long of code. That was only worth 2 points. The second part B, it was pretty darn similar to what was in the string, the Magpie lab. That was only 2 points as well. You did have to see, is the keyword in there? What's before it? What's after it? Do it without any bounds errors. That to me was a fair amount of code for only 2 points. Anyway, and so part A, part B were both worth 2. That means that part C is worth 5. And here's what we get with that. So do I access all items in my message list? And you don't get a point if there are bounds, if you have an out of bounds exception. And this is going to do that. The minus is going to make sure that I access every single one. That I've got to use the keyword, or the method that we wrote contains word. I'm doing that right here. I remove, I add all and only identified entries to the new list. I'm not adding any that shouldn't be there. I'm not adding them all. I can see that being a common mistake people might make. So I'm adding the correct ones. I'm removing all the identified ones. I'm not removing them all. And then I return that. So all of them are a single point, and pretty straightforward. That's the solution for part C there. The second question, this is the one that I gave you recently. You had a cookie order class and a master order class. So there were 2 that we were working with. Cookie order consists of a string that has the type of cookie that you're selling, and an int, that's the number of boxes that are ordered for that particular type. And then in the master order class, there's a master order object that I think is called orders. That is an array list of cookie orders. And part A, we're supposed to get the total number of boxes. All right, so if I have a list that has all of these orders in it, what boxes are part of that master order? That's part A. Part B, kind of similar to what we just did, we're going to remove certain cookies that are of a certain type from that array list. So to get the total number of boxes in that array list, I got to create a counter, right? So I'm going to start at 0 and add up all the boxes for all of the orders, and then return that at the very end. I'm going to traverse the array list of cookie orders. I'm going to find out how many boxes are in the next element in that array list, add that to counter, and then at the very end, I'm going to add counter. So the algorithm for this is really not that difficult, 4 steps, but pretty straightforward. So there it is. There's the whole code. All right, so that's the whole thing. I used a for each loop. I could have done a traditional for, but I'm not deleting any. I'm just going through top to bottom and counting. So I'm not adding elements to the array list. I'm not deleting any. The size is going to stay the same. So for each loop looks like that's going to work. And there is this guy here. This came from the cookie order object that they have a getter for that. A get num boxes is going to return that particular one. So for every cookie order in my orders, I am going to get the number of boxes that are going to be used for um, that particular project. All right. So I keep doing that. Notice that I don't need curly braces here for that. And the reason for that is I'm only doing one line here. So if I have an if statement, if I have a for loop, and the only thing I'm doing is outputting, or the only thing I'm doing is counting, I'm only doing one thing, it's only one line, then because there's no semicolon here, this is all considered to be one line. If I needed to do multiple things on that, then yes, I am in fact going to need to create that. Let me see if I can time out here. Okay. So that is the solution. And again, make sure that you return that value at the end, and you're all good. So here is their solution. This is an older one. Again, as I said, in recent years, they tend to, I'm seeing them move away from this. So in this particular situation, if you have um, they're breaking those points down, obviously. Do you access any element of that, you get a half point. If you access them all without any out of bounds errors, then you get the other half, which is I guess a nice way of doing that. So sure enough, I'm going to get the half point because I'm accessing any element here. I'm getting the first one, off we go. And I'm going to get all of them because I've got a nice for each, and that I don't need to worry about out of bounds. The for each loop is going to do that automatically. And then I'm going to compute the total. Do I have an accumulator? That's this guy total. I declare and initialize that to 0. If you just declared it, if you said total semicolon, this isn't going to work. So even though technically 0 is stored in total, if you put a semicolon there, if you try to use the plus equals operator, it's gonna error. You got to call the num boxes method. I do that, and then quickly accumulate the total number of boxes, and then I return it. So I think I'm going to get all 3 points for part A. Not very difficult. It's a fair amount for number of points. I think 3 for a relatively simple solution. The remove variety, it has the exact same problem that we did before. This is returning, I believe, how many orders did we remove? They don't want the array list, which is what we did in the previous problem. They want to count up how many elements, how many boxes were in each element that we're removing. So I'm going to create a counter variable for that. I'm going to traverse my order array list. Similar to the other issue, I'm not going to use a for each. I've got to use a traditional for because I'm going to be removing elements. If the variety, the next order has the description of that is the keyword, then I'm going to add the number of boxes that were for that order to my counter variable. I'm going to remove that order, and because it's an array list, I got to decrement the iterator. All right. By the way, if I were doing this with an array, I wouldn't need to decrement the order because the size of the array is going to be fixed. So I could set if I were to, quote, remove an element from an array, I would set the value at that particular cell to be null, and then move on. And so I'm not moving one over into that slot and skipping over. So the decrement is only if you're going to be removing elements from an array list and the size is going to shrink. I haven't seen them do this, but if they gave you an array and said remove those elements, you don't really remove it. You can't delete an element. You got to put null in that particular slot. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to be adding them all up, and then when I'm done with that loop, then I'm going to return the total number of boxes that I removed. That's my algorithm. Here's code that I came up with. there's the method declaration. It takes a string cookie bar as the parameter. There's my counter accumulator, to quote the College Board. I'm going to start at 0, go to cookies.size, increment by 1. And again, my solution to that is I'm going to get the next one, store that in a temp. And in this case, I want to make sure that so if I'm removing all of the oatmeal raisin cookies, I want to test to see, is the get variety equal to the parameter? Notice that I've got to call the dot equals method in order to do that. That's because strings are objects, and we can't use the double equal sign to test for equality of objects. That's testing memory location and not the actual letters that are in that particular string. So in that case, if the get variety equals the parameter, now I know that's a cookie that's supposed to be removed. So I'm going to increment my total by how many boxes there are. I can't just add it by 1. It's not how many orders were removed, it's how many boxes were removed. So I have to get those number of boxes and add them. Notice too that because I initialized this to 0 at the beginning, I can use the plus equals operator on that. I'm going to now remove orders. If there were 2 oatmeal raisins in a row, it would skip over it. So I better decrement the iterator. I do that with the I minus minus, and then at the end I'm going to return total, and that's the end of my method. So pretty straightforward, pretty similar to the last one. It's a little slight twist on getting that. Here is the rubric, 6 points for this. So do I match and remove all of them? So 4 points, and you can kind of go through, do I access an element? Do I access them all? Do I call the get variety? I do. So I get a half point for that. Do I compare the parameter with a variety? Yep, I do that. Do I remove it from orders? I do. There it is. And only removes only matching orders. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm doing that. Missing a open curly brace, so that's an issue. Removes all matching cookie order objects and no element skip. That's the minus minus part. So I think I'll get that a point for that. Lastly, a point and a half if I create the accumulator. There it is, total, that I call the get num boxes. Do that, get a half point for that, and then add it all up. That's all good, and I get a half point if I return it, and sure enough I do. A couple things to note on this particular one. You're going to lose a point if you do not refer to orders. If it's the same type and you created your own array list and referred to that array list, you would lose 1 point. What's a little weird is that the name of this class is called master orders. The instance variable, the array list, that's the instance variable here, is called orders. So you've got master orders as the class name and then orders as the array list. If you were to call it master orders all the way through, they're going to ding you 1.5 points. Personally, I feel that's an awful lot of points to be, that's a pretty hefty penalty. So make sure that when you're doing that, you're calling things by the correct name. Just double check and make sure master orders make sense and you're in the heat of the battle. It's easy to kind of overlook that. That's a pretty hefty penalty, and that's not uncommon, by the way. I've seen them do that on other tests where they use a different name. If you change what they call persistent data, this parameter, they're going to ding you for that. So that was that was one question, and then here is another. This is this thing, a string coder class. It was a way of encrypting a message, kind of a cool little encryption app. There are two classes that are used to encode a message. One is called a string part, and the other is going to take all those together. They gave you a pretty good example. Hopefully the example made some sense. Big long string, and we can look for the word overeager inside that string and keep bouncing around and finding one or more letters together, putting them all into an array list of string parts, and that's going to be our encrypted message from that particular master. So the one thing that we need to know is that the string part returns where in that master list of strings, where's the index, where am I going to start, and then how many letters are we talking about. Notice that it's what the length is of that substring, not what is the index of that point. So it's not the index start stop, it's the index to start and how many letters do we go. So it's just something to be juggling back there as you're thinking about this. Our job is to write the decode string method and in part A, and then part B is we have to write how to decode that. All right, so we have an array list of string parts. We're giving that as a parameter. And we're trying to then go through all of those, find out, we're going to be doing substrings to that master, starting at different points, going for however long that is going to go, pull out a substring of that, and then put those all together in a temp. That's our basic challenge. Part of this is, can you think clearly about what are they actually asking you to do? That's, I think, a lot of, if you just jumped into starting to code without being super clear about what it is that they're asking for, there are a lot of rabbit holes on this particular problem that you might end up going down. So I'm going to traverse the array list. I'm with every one that is there. I know what its starting index is, and I know how many letters it's going to take. I'm going to create a substring from master string, beginning at that starting point and stopping at that. That's going to store that substring in a temp. I'm going to join all the temps together and then finally return that when we're done. That's how to decode a method using this particular algorithm. So here is what we get. So there's my method declaration. It's returning a string. It takes an array list of string parts as a parameter we're given that. So I've got answer. I'm going to be concatenating to that. So that's the plus equals. Because of that, I'm going to put nothing in that, open and close quote, so that it is, in fact, an empty string when I begin. All I'm doing is starting at the beginning and going through all of them, not removing, not adding. So a for each loop makes the most sense in this particular case. So for every string part in the array list parts, notice that's the parameter. What I do is I'm going to find out what's the index of start and what's the index of n at end -1. And so I'm gonna do it that way. I could have gotten the end, gotten the length, and added them together. Got to do some arithmetic, some adding somewhere along the line. I'm going to create the second one, and I need to just make sure, is this getting all the letters that I want? So if the word is cat, and I know it's starting at position 5, for example. So if it's starting at position 5 and the word is cat, that's 3. So start plus length is going to give me 8. Is that right? So I've got cat, so that's going to be starting at position 5. That's 5, 6, 7. It looks like I'm off by 1. All right, so 8 is going to be the next letter after the T But remember that on substring with two parameters, the end is always 1 minus. So I've got to make sure that it is in fact going to get that t, and it will. All right. So if I took the word is cat, and I start at 5, 5 plus 3 is 8. The index of the last one is 7. So the end here is going to be exactly what I want when I use the substring with two parameters. I would recommend, as if when you take the test, if they're asking you to use substring with two parameters, are you getting exactly what, and use cat, uses, is that going to get me what I want? Just kind of walk through it. Is that going to work correctly? All right. So I've got these two temp variables here, start and end. Now I'm going to create that string, the temp. I'm going to go to my master string. That this is in an instance variable in this particular class. I'm going to call substring, can't see it because I have my pretty face there, but I'm going to call it start to end. That's going to acquire that section of the master string, store that in temp. I'm going to combine answer with temp, and that is the end of my for each loop. I'm just going to keep going to start at the beginning and add them all up. When I'm done with that, answer should be complete, so I'm simply going to return answer, and we're done. Here is the College Board's solution. Do I traverse all the parts? I do, because I'm using a for each loop, so I get a point for that. Am I retrieving substrings from master string? Yep, I'm doing that. This line in here was calling the substring, so I get a half point for that. I get a point and a half for extracting a substring from master that starts at substring XY. So I get a half a point for that, and I get a full point because it is in fact going to be the correct substring that I have. So if I added one or subtracted one, I'd miss out on that last point. But simply because I used substring with two parameters, I get a half point. So even if you don't get all the points, I'd be getting something. Good. Thank you, College Board. Then I'm going to be building and decoding a string. So I create a string based on substrings from master, and I return that built string. Sure enough, I do that with answer. So that to me seems like a very solid 4.5 points for part A. Part B, I've got to encode. I get a parameter of a particular message, and I'm going to return an array list of string parts. Okay, then. So I better make that array list to begin with. There is a method in just thinking about this. How do I encode it? Most likely, a lot of students are going to be thinking about how do you encode it? Well, there's a method that they're not showing us called find part. They say this exists, works perfectly. We're not showing you how we did it. That is the part that is going to be doing, as I say, the heavy lifting. That's the main piece that's going to be putting all of this together. So I think the downside to this question is that the way that the thing is encoded is actually somewhat of a mystery. We're not able to actually see what that actually is. So I'm going to create an empty array list of string parts. I'm going to loop through repeatedly until I get all of those parts. That when I call that find part method, that's going to return a string part. I've got to add that to the array list. And then what needs to happen is, so I've found you take a long string and it's going to return part of, we don't know how long that string part actually is. So I'm going to truncate the original message that we're trying to encode repeatedly until I get down to 0. And when I do that, I've encoded the whole thing. All right, so this is going to be a while loop, and it's while this length is greater than 0. So we'll keep chopping it down again and again and again until finally I've got all the parts found, and I can then return that array list. Again, there's some thinking that has to go into this. So this is where the jumping in and scratching your pencil across the page right from the beginning can get you into some trouble unless you really think about it pretty carefully. Make sure that you read the whole question. They'll throw in some methods that you may or may not use. Read them, right? Know what they are, because if you skipped over that find part method, you would be in a world of hurt without that. So here's my code to do that. Again, it's going to return an array list of string parts. I get a big long string that I'm supposed to encode. First thing I'm going to do is create the empty array list. I'll call it SP list. That is an array list of string parts. So there it is. It's made. It's empty. The other thing that I do here is there's nothing wrong. In fact, I think the solution that the College Board actually gives modifies word again and again and again and again. I've seen in rubrics and free response rubrics, if students modify the parameter, they get dinged a pretty hefty penalty for modifying what they refer to as persistent data. So my solution is, if I'm asked to do anything and manipulate a string that comes as a parameter, I will not affect that parameter. I'm going to set it as a temp and modify the heck out of the temp. So whenever I see, and then I'm going to be shrinking that down, I'm going to be modifying it, I'm going to be flipping words around or changing the order, and it came as a parameter, my recommendation, store that in a temp variable and manipulate the temp. The parameter is going to stay pristine, and you won't get that penalty should they assign that. So I do that. There's nothing in the rules and in the code, in the prompt, that says don't do it, but I'm not going to get penalized for it. So what am I going to do? I'm going to keep going. I'm going to be truncating temp again and again and again, slicing off the first part every time that I find a string part, cut part of that off, and then keep going, and eventually I'll find the whole thing. So keep going until while the length is greater than 0. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to call the find part method. I pass temp, and that's going to find out where in that master does it begin, and it returns, again, that string part, identifies the index where it starts and how many letters is that going to be. Now SP is, again, that's a temp. That's something that doesn't exist anywhere but inside my while loop. I'm going to add that to my my new array list, SP list. Could I combine these guys, and instead of SP, could I put this dot find? Yep, sure could. So I could save a line. I do think it makes a little bit more sense than just walking things through step by step. I'm not going to be overlooking anything. Now what I'm doing is, this is where the truncating of temp comes in. So I know how long that's going to be. Let's say the first word is cat. Cat is found. So it starts at position 0 and the length is 3. This, with substring with one parameter, starts at that index and goes all the way to the end. That is, in fact, going to get rid of the word cat. So if the word were cat is at position 0, 1, 2. 3 is how many letters there are. The third letter, their position 3, is actually the fourth letter. And so by doing substring at position 3 is going to get the fourth letter, go all the way to the end. That's everything else except for the word cat. So temp is going to now has been truncated by whatever that first word happens to be. So that looks good. That should be the end of my while loop. When I'm done with my while loop, temp is now down to 0. Everything has been added to SP list. So all I got to do at this point is return the list. And that's it. So here is their solution to that. So that's the decode string. Hang on a second. Okay. So here's the rubric to that. Thanks for your patience. I get a half point if I create a new array list of string parts. I do that, get a half point. Here's 3.5 if I find, collect string parts and build them in the context of a loop. I find part X, where X is the substring of a word. I've got that. Calls the find part method. I've got the find part. Yep, do that. Adds the found string and then correctly builds a list of string parts. Must have used find part to do that. So pretty sure that I'm able to do that in here. And then lastly, I get a half point if I return that array list of string parts. So 4.5 for each part A, part B. And that is it. College Board does like array lists, so you can probably expect to find one question that is going to deal with that. You'll find a question that's going to deal with string manipulation and definitely loops. I think they got rid of the two-dimensional array, so you don't need to worry about that, but you will probably need to worry about arrays and array lists. So that's it. Ta-da. Hope you're doing well, and we'll have a little group meeting on Thursday. All right, so be prepared for that, and hopefully you're all well. That's my hope anyway. Take care. Talk to you soon. All right, bye.